Welcome back, music fans. I'm your host, William Ford from AtlantaMusicCritic.com, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have you join me today. We have a real treat in store for you as we continue to delve into the world of classical music with none other than the incredibly talented pianist, Quynh Nguyen. Hailing from New York City, Quynh takes us on a journey through her remarkable life, from her childhood in Vietnam to her upbringing within her family's rich musical history. But that's just the beginning. Quynh shares with us her experiences studying in France and Moscow before ultimately finding a home in the United States. But wait, there's more. We'll also be exploring Quynh's artistic evolution, delving into her love of French music, and her discovery of the captivating composer Germaine Tailleferre. You won't want to miss her insights into this remarkable but underappreciated composer. Further, we will discover Quynh's deep admiration for composer Paul Chihara, known mostly for his music for the silver screen. Quynh shares with us her personal connection to Chihara's work, rooted in their shared love of Vietnam and strong anti-war sentiments. But hey, that's just scratching the surface here. Quynh talks about her recently released albums, featuring the compositions of both Tailleferre and Chihara. If you're loving what you're hearing and want to support our mission of bringing you captivating interviews with classical music's finest, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell. Your support ensures that more music enthusiasts like yourself can discover the magic of our interviews. And last, but certainly not least, consider becoming a patron over at www.patreon.com/Atlanta Music Critic. Your support truly means the world to us, and it helps us to continue bringing the incredible stories and talents of musicians like Quynh Nguyen. At the end of our interview, we will hear an excerpt of Quynh's new recording of Chihara's Concerto-Fantasy. It's something you won't want to miss. Thank you for all of your support. Let's dive into Ms. Nguyen's extraordinary journey together. So how are you?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm pretty good. Where are you located?
I'm in New York.
Okay. As I recollect, you're on the faculty at Hunter College.
Yes,
All
I
right.
am teaching there as an adjunct professor.
Where were you born?
I was born in Hanoi after the war. Yeah, it was 1 year after the war ended. Yeah, my parents actually had my sister 4 years before that during the war, and they had told me that they had to hide, underground and had all sorts of difficulties. But I was born after the war, so it was relatively bomb-free at the time.
What was it like growing up there for you?
I was a kid and I was not too aware of my surroundings when I was very little. I remember the trees, the flowers in the summertime. I remember my friends. I remember playing on the street. I know that the lights would go out sometimes and I would practice with the kerosene lamp. I had a piano at home and I also have a piano. I had a piano at my grandparents' home. And my grandmother and my aunts and uncles from my mother's side were musicians. So I spent a lot of time in my grandparents' home because that's where they kind of gave me lessons and I practiced over there. I went to school and we all had this red, it's like a necktie, but it's like a tie that you wear and it's everyone has to wear it. It's like a part of the uniform. And we all learn Russian in school because that was the required language. And then I when I was 6, I started going to the Hanoi Conservatory for music. So I would go there, I think, at least a few times a week. And we would have lessons and I would have even theory lessons and classes with friends. And growing up, that's all I knew. So it felt just the way it was.
You had the piano in the family,
Right.
so you must have started lessons very early on.
I think I started around 4. I remember my uncle giving me lessons and had me learn how to read notes. I had the swing, my grandfather had swings and he also had a garden with birds and he loved orchids. And I remember spending time in his room, trying to learn the notes, spending time in his garden and doing all of that. And yes, I started practicing. I was introduced to the piano because of my uncle. He was my first teacher. That's how I started. And then I had formal lessons at 6.
So your uncle was musically inclined.
Yeah, he was very much so. He was involved in the war as a paramedic. He loved music, and he actually didn't learn how to play the piano until he was much older. But he was very, very passionate about music, and he would play a lot of recordings for me and introduce me to all these great pianists and the symphonies. And he would constantly play music to the annoyance of my grandfather sometimes. My grandmother actually passed away the year I was born, so she met me when I was first born, but a few months after she passed away. But she had looked at my hands and said that I had hands that were good enough to play. And she was a musician herself. She was actually a trained classical pianist, and she learned the piano and had training in Paris. And she studied law in Paris as well. And both my grandmother and my grandfather had opportunities to study in France. I have 2 aunts that were also pianists. So a lot of musicians from my mom's side of the family. One of my aunts was trained at the Moscow Conservatory, and she is now currently teaching at the Hans Eisler Conservatory in Berlin. And then the other aunt was trained in Hungary. And my uncle was never trained, but he had a teacher who came from Poland to teach him. I'm not sure, I must have been during the French occupation, because during the war, I don't think that he received any training, and he was a paramedic then. But yeah, he had a Polish teacher that he learned a lot from and talked to me about the techniques and all the. I had different influences from my relatives, definitely.
You started at 6 in the conservatory. Right. I mean, was that structured to provide your entire education or just the music?
Oh, just the music part of it. I went to the regular elementary school, yeah, during the day, and then I would have lessons, I think, once or twice a week. And then in the weekend, I think we have like a class meeting, like a theory class or something like that.
What did your peers think about your going to the conservatory?
I don't know if they knew I played the piano at the elementary school, and my music friends just, I don't know, we just play around.
From there, you took lessons, I assume, through elementary and whatever the equivalent of junior and senior high
No,
school.
so my teacher at the Hanoi Conservatory was actually trained in France. He had an opportunity to study in France. And when he came back, he became the head of the piano department. And I studied with him up until I was 11. And then there was a delegation from Russia that came to audition the students. And I received full scholarship to study in Moscow. So at 13, I left with a group of kids who were about like 15, 16. I was the youngest. And there were about 5 or 6 of us that went over to the Gnesin Institute to study. That was very interesting. I mean, I think I was the only one with like lots and lots of dolls all over the place. And I stay at the dormitory and practice in the school's basement. And I was exposed to, the Grand Hall in Moscow and all these great musical events, and also minus 40 degrees Celsius weather. It was like ice skating everywhere you go. And this was before the disintegration of the USSR. So things were relatively calm. I was only there for 1 year. My parents and I we immigrated to San Diego after that. My aunt in San Diego had sponsored us. And right after I left, things were a lot less calm in the USSR at that time. So yeah, it was a lot of things that were in flux. When I left, the Berlin Wall had just fell, and we went to my aunt in Berlin, and she was East Berlin, and my father went over to West Berlin to the American consulate, and that's how we were able to leave Berlin to go to the United States, because as you know, at that time, Berlin was still divided.
You went from Moscow to San Diego. If nothing else, it would be a climate shock.
It was a big climate shock. I mean, I have family in San Diego, and that's why we went there. It was very, very different, and I had understood whatever I was taught in school about the Vietnam War. I also understood what my parents told me, which is, war is something that everybody loses, because everybody get hurt, and we have family members from both from the same family that fought on both sides, and there were casualties everywhere, and it did take a lot of adjustment and understanding, and I mean, and when I first went to San Diego, I didn't speak any English. I had only had Russian training up until then, so I started out at school right away, and I remember trying to learn, from the very, very basic, how to form a sentence, because I had credit. I had received credit for some of the classes. I actually skipped a grade and went into high school and studied at the Venice High School for 2 years and a half. And then by the time I was 17, I had already had scholarship to go to Juilliard.
So how quickly did you pick up English?
Well, I remember that I had always loved reading so much when I was little. I read so much. I read The Mount of Monte Cristo. I read things about Marie Curie, because both my parents are chemists. I read just novels and stories, everything that I could grab. When I was in Vietnam, I didn't read so much in Russia. I was only there for 1 year, and there was a lot to just learn. When I went to San Diego, actually, after a few months, my parents moved to Los Angeles. And so when we were there for those 2 years and a half, I read everything that I could. I went to the library a lot. And so by the time that I was at Juilliard, I was still having a hard time, but it took time. But I had graduated high school with high marks, and I received the Presidential Excellence Award for extraordinary efforts to achieve. And so I think that my reading skills were better than my speaking skills at that time. Yeah. But it wasn't adjustment for sure. I mean, even when I was at Juilliard, I came to New York all by myself. I actually came to audition at Juilliard by myself, and studied there, and I didn't know anyone there. And I didn't know anyone in New York, and I lived in the dorm in New York. And again, it was a huge adjustment, like a lot of different adjustments in a very short time during my teenage years, for sure.
Do you think in English?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I think I do. Yeah. I mean, when I count, I still count in Vietnamese sometimes. And my parents live here in New York. They came here about 7 years ago, so I talk to them regularly. But before that, for a very, very long time, since I came to New York since 17, I lived here in New York, basically on my own. Like, I don't have relatives. I have friends and mentors and teachers.
You went through Juilliard for how many years?
I was there for 4 years. So I did my bachelor's with Bela Davidovich, and then I went to Mannes to study with Jerome Rose, and that was for 2 years. And then I went to the grad center of City University of New York, the Graduate Center, to do my doctoral of musical arts. And while there, while I was at Juilliard, I developed great love for Messiaen's music, because I had heard some of his Vent Regard, in the practice rooms, and I tried to play some of them. And it was very difficult for me at that time. But when I was doing my doctorate, that was my focus and interest, was in Messiaen's music, and also French music, but in Messiaen's music. And so I was invited by Yvonne Loriot to study with her. So I had a year in Paris to study with Yvonne on Messiaen's music. And it was a great experience. Like, I felt so much closer to the music, and I felt like, from looking at things from her point of view and her eyes, things seem a lot more just accessible. My first piano teacher was trained in France, and so I learned a lot of French music growing up, like Debussy and Ravel, and also French music is Asian influence, so it's something that's very closely. It feels very close to me in my understanding and in my heart, and I am inspired by it because it's a lot of the music that you hear is about, like, for example, Debussy wrote about the pagoda, and Ravel. Well, I just love Ravel's music and the harmonies and the pentatonic scales. And Messiaen's music was influenced by Indian style of rhythm and melodies and harmonies, and so all of that feels to me to feels very familiar somehow.
Did you ever have much experience with the microtonal nature of music in Southeast Asia as opposed to like the
That's a great
Western?
question. Yes. So yes, growing up, I heard all these music, all these traditional music would play at the conservatory for sure. There's the danbo. It's like one string instrument that you can play with a long bow, and it has like the body is like this, and on the you put it on the ground and you play with, and it's microtonal. And there's I think the traditional Vietnamese music, in the songs and in the traditional opera style, it's also microtonals. And I'll say the Vietnamese language is very tonal as well.
Right, Thai language is very
Yeah.
tonal also. You can use the same sound but alter the tone to mean very
Yeah, I
different
think we have
things.
7 marks, and the same word can have different meanings, just changing the marks.
Aside from Messiaen, do you have other favorite composers?
Yeah, so I'm currently in love with Germaine Tailleferre's music. I discovered her music living in France, learning more about her music, and about her life. Like, her music was just so incredible, and I tried to research on her music and didn't find a lot of performances of it. So I became very fascinated with it. I recorded a CD of her works last year, and it was released on Music and Arts. And I know that she had problems with her estate, so then there were all these scores that were not available for many years, that are currently being released. Her music is just incredibly beautiful. It's like a mix between Satie and Debussy and Ravel, and also neoclassical and different influences. And also she had popular music influences as well in her writing. And she had bitonality and very inventive rhythm. And some of her, like, one of her most beloved works, I think, is the Ballad for Piano and Orchestra. It's just very, she has luscious harmonies and gorgeous melodies.
It's quite
Yeah,
lovely. And in some ways, it struck me as almost neo-romantic.
that's definitely true. I think she was more neo-romantic in early life and midlife, and then she became influenced by neoclassicism. And and then after that, I think she wrote, yeah, I mean, she wrote in different styles, and I think she learned from Picasso. She was friends with Picasso and Modigliani, and she said in one of her interviews that Picasso told her to constantly reinvent himself. So she constantly changes styles. But she was quite close to Ravel. She had associations with him for 3 years, and he was one of the mentors, and Satie as well. And she was part of the Lycée, so I think she was also influenced by the friends that she was.
Do you do a lot of concertizing yourself?
Well, that's a good question. So I have been doing a bit more. I recently performed with the Seattle Symphony in a concert called Celebrate Asia. In next week, I'm performing with the Springfield Symphony Orchestra, the Piano Concerto-Fantasy by Paul Chihara, and the Beethoven Choral Fantasy. I'm playing Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time at the International Keyboard Institute and Festival at Merkin this summer. And in 2022, I performed with the Vietnam National Symphony Orchestra for the 25th anniversary of Vietnam US, which was rescheduled from 2020, but COVID happened at that time.
The reason I asked the question about concertizing is wondering if there's some kind of crossover between your concertizing and your advocacy for Tailleferre, for example. In other words, do you attempt to program her music?
For the solo works, it's more of my control, and I also interested in learning and expanding more into chamber music for her works as well. Currently, it's easier to reach more listeners with recordings.
Even to be able to promote and get an audience for her music may be difficult, just because there's so much out there.
That's one of the reasons why I wanted to promote her music too, because I think that it's incredibly beautiful, and it should be as accessible as Satie, for example, or some other Chopin pieces. The pieces that I recorded were on the smaller scale, and so I think a whole program of her music would be harder to program. I think that individual pieces or a group of pieces together perhaps with other French music or romantic music would work well. I'm very much interested in learning her ballad for piano and orchestra, and also hope to play her larger scale works. And I think that chamber music would be easier as well. But yes, I think that's one of the reasons why I was fascinated with her music, is because I think musically, the value of it, and just the what it brings, like the joy and the beauty it brings, is just as beautiful as any other French music that I hear, and or romantic music. And you're right, I'm drawn to the romanticism in her music. It's like French type of romanticism. She passed away in 1983, which is very interesting because she passed away 1 year after Messiaen, and her music couldn't be any different. They exist in the same city for, I think, 60 years, but never crossed paths, and completely different styles. And he's extremely well known, of course. And she had a difficult life, and she was actually going, like, during the war, she came to the United States, and she came here briefly, and then went back to France. And she had a very difficult personal life as well. She didn't have any support from her husbands. She had supports from her mentors and musical friends, and she had success as a pianist, and as a composer as well. She wrote hundreds of works, a lot for the piano, but also operas and ballets and chamber music. But in her personal life, like, her husband tried to dissuade her from composing, to the point like one poured ink on her manuscript. That was how bad it was. But she said that she kept on composing because it brought her joy, and it's like a way to escape.
Mm-hmm. You're having just released another recording. You want to talk about that?
Yes, so I recorded the complete works of Paul Chihara. So he's a Japanese American composer, and he also was a very fascinating person, because he had told me that he all his life had dealt with war. He grew up in the Japanese internment camp, and then he went through the Vietnam War. I think he was a professor at that time. He had also written music for films and movies about the Vietnam War. And so when I met with him, it was just a really fascinating person to talk to, because he had all this history with him. And actually, he told me that his wife's grandparents had met Ho Chi Minh, because they lived in Asia during the war, and had an opportunity to meet with Ho Chi Minh. And so when I met with him, he had told me how he was very much opposed to the Vietnam War, and all the chaos and destruction that it brought. First, he showed me the piano duet, Ami, he had written for Pascal Roger and his wife, Ami, which was very French and gorgeous and fun. And so I was immediately attracted to that harmony and that style of writing. And then he showed me a melody that he had written for the show China Beach, that he said, "This is my melody that I have felt very inspired to write, and I want you to listen to it because this is my melody that I call the Vietnam melody, and I had held on to it for like over 30 years because I've loved it so much and I have never let go of it. I wanted you to hear it. And so when I heard it, it was this gorgeous, peaceful, lovely melody that had a lot of different contours, like rise and falls, and it immediately made me think of like the green fields of Vietnam, and it has a nostalgic quality to it. And so we started talking. I was interested in recording his music after hearing all these, different pieces. And he also showed me one of the reveries that he had written for Ursula Oppens that was called The Tempest, inspired by Beethoven's Tempest. And then I heard his bagatelles that he had written for Jerome Lowenthal. And I learned that the bagatelles were actually inspired by the Japanese haikus poems. And so I became interested in recording his music for Naxos. It became a project that I wanted to work on with him to record his complete piano works for the Naxos American Classics series.
I listened to some of his music also, and again, it struck me as lushly
That's right.
neo-romantic. Is that
It is
fair?
fair, the bagatelles, he had told me that he had grouped together some of his most favorite melodies in his life. And one of them was written for his wife, which was very beautiful. It was almost like reminiscent of a pop song, a love song. And then there were others. There was a toccata that was influenced by Shostakovich or Prokofiev. And then there were other things, like one was a tribute to William Bolcom, who was a friend. But yes, a lot of romanticism and tonal music.
When did you record
I
that?
recorded it in 2023. I recorded the piano concerto with the London Symphony Orchestra in 2022. And then I recorded the rest of them at the end of 2022.
When you did the recording with the London Symphony, were you in London?
We had planned to record that concerto earlier, but COVID happened. And then when it abated a bit, we were able to, Paul was actually at home writing music for 3 months straight without being able to go outside at all during the COVID pandemic. But then in January of 2022, the London Symphony started working again. And so there was an opportunity to come and record there. And it was I felt incredibly lucky because Omicron was actually raging over in London. And we managed to fly over there without getting sick. And everyone, the conductor and the producer did not get COVID before the recording. And we all had to get tested on the day of to make sure that everybody was negative, because there was one person who was positive that was on the train who had to be sent back. The recording went beautifully. It was such a magnificent and memorable experience. We recorded the entire concerto in 4 hours, including rehearsal. The conductor was Stefan Barlow, so we had been able to rehearse with him before that. It was very, very lucky that Paul was in good enough health, and he was able to come and supervise the rehearsals and the recording and the interview there as well.
Great conversation. I really appreciate it. Anything that you want to add, that you'd like to add?
Well, I wanted to add that this piano concerto is extremely personal to me because it was inspired by Paul's writing from films and music for movies about the Vietnam War. And also he had listened to so many stories and songs from the Vietnamese refugees, as well as the veterans coming back from the war. The concerto is kind of programmatic because it started out very peaceful and it had a theme that was supposed to be my theme. And then it led on to the second movement, in which there's a jazzy passage that was supposed to mean America coming to Vietnam. And it was a very friendly and fun music. There was a love theme in the second movement as well that Paul had said that he had used throughout his life many, many times, but he was first composed it for his wife 40 years ago. And then in the third movement, that's when the war began, and that's when the music was descriptive of wartime, and there were bullets, and there were fragmentation and chaos and darkness and turbulence, and there was a lot going on, of a lot of dissonances as well. And then there were also harmonic chords that were reminiscent of Mussorgsky's music. All that led into the fourth movement, in which there was joy, and there was a dance between the together from with the piano and the orchestra, called the Hanoi Rag. And it was all very joyful, and then it ended peacefully. And so the piece has a lot of meaning to me, because I think it, it transitions, and it leads from wartime, and it leads from difficulties and chaos to beauty and joy and peace, and kind of like a reconciliation, and a lot of hopefulness and beauty at the end.
I'm going to have to cut it off, because if I don't, Zoom's going to cut it off. Hey, it was great talking with you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great meeting you.
Great meeting you, and I hope at some time I'm going to be able to hear you in person. So I look forward to that.
Thank you.